Alrighty, hello everyone. Today we are going to be continuing talking about generation technologies. So in lecture 2, we talked about fossil fuel, and in the previous lecture we covered renewables. And so today we're going to talk about the remaining technologies that are used for power generation in our electricity sector. The first being nuclear. So this is probably the last kind of major generation technology that produces a substantial amount of electricity. There's going to be a number of other smaller ones that we cover, but are generally going to be a little bit more minor. So let's revisit one of the older plots that I've been showing in some of the previous lectures. So this plot is about when capacity broken down by fuel type was deployed in the United States. Okay, and so we're going to be focusing specifically on nuclear. And so that is in the red, as you can see, starting in the 70s, early 70s was kind of the first nuclear power. Um, and for a period of about 2 decades, a number of nuclear power plants were installed and deployed in the US. And following that, uh, very few nuclear has come online as operational for generating electricity. And we'll get to some of the reasons about the decline of nuclear and why that is. Um, but we're going to start off kind of similarly with our previous discussions about the fuel and how we actually get energy out of it. Okay, and so one thing to start off with is talking about the actual reaction that takes place that we use to extract energy. So, you guys may have heard of nuclear fusion and nuclear fission. And just to be clear, uh, nuclear fusion is not a procedure that is currently used to produce electricity for our grid. Okay, still in the research and development stage. That joke is kind of, nuclear fusion is another, 10, 15 years away. It is now, and 10, 15 years ago, it was still 10 to 15 years away. Um, so there are a number of sort of technological issues and hurdles that still have to be overcome with nuclear fusion, um, in addition to any sort of economic hurdles that might arise if it ever does make it out of the lab. So, putting that aside for now, uh, all of the nuclear power plants in the US and across the world currently use some form of nuclear fission to power their nuclear reactions and generate energy uh, and electricity. So the main one that we think about with nuclear fission is the splitting of uranium 235. Okay, so 235 refers to the number of protons and neutrons in the nucleus of the uranium. And if you shoot a neutron at this particular atom, it is in a relatively unstable state where it can be essentially split in this nuclear fission process, which is essentially splitting an atom. So the difference between kind of the chemical reaction that we've seen with fossil fuels is that in combustion, what you're doing is you're actually breaking molecules apart. But in nuclear reactions, you are, specifically in fission, you are breaking atoms apart. And so, this particular reaction, where you split uranium 235 into isotopes of barium and krypton, um, releases a tremendous amount of energy. So, there is a lot of energy contained in the sort of bonds that hold the atom together. Um, and so, Doing this is going to release a lot of energy. You'll also notice that this reaction produces three sort of neutrons as well, right? And so those neutrons on the output side of this reaction can then go on to impact other uranium atoms and sort of continue in this kind of chain reaction. And so when we think about energy density, we had covered in lecture one, some of that context about, how different amounts of, or different types of fuels contain different amounts of energy. We didn't actually talk about uranium and sort of nuclear fuel particularly. And here, uh, you can see that from an order of magnitude perspective, it's many, many, many times more energy dense than any of the fossil fuels that we were talking about. So a kilogram of uranium 235 can produce 24 gigawatt hours of energy, right? And so that's literally millions of times more energy content than in our coal. And that's one of the compelling pieces of nuclear power production. All right, and so in terms of resource availability, this is a bit of an older figure, but shows, relatively speaking, where the resource availability is. Um, if you were to take all of the resources together and add them all up, you're talking about on the order of 3.5 to 6 million tons of uranium, right? And so if you were to take about 27 tons of raw uranium fuel, you could power a single 1 gigawatt nuclear reactor for a year, for over a year, right? And so relatively speaking, again, compared to the amount of fossil fuels that we're sort of burning, um, the uranium, because it is so energy dense, uh, you need relatively small amounts of it to provide kind of the same amounts of electricity that we're talking about. Okay, and so let's talk a little bit about the nuclear fuel cycle. So this is a diagram that shows kind of the cycle for starting from uranium in nature and what needs to happen in order to essentially get that through a reactor to produce electricity. Okay, and so this is essentially the sort of processing steps needed. So once you have mined and extracted the uranium, it is milled into a particular compound called yellowcake, which is a uranium oxide. You pass this through a centrifuge to increase U-235 concentration. And what I'll mention here is that this enrichment process, right, is essentially making it so that you have enough of that concentration of U-235 so that it can act as a fuel. Now, in relation to nuclear weaponry, which is very different, right, from what we actually have in a nuclear power plant. This is one of the sort of key steps that makes a really big difference. The concentrations that you need to bring U-235 up to make it effective in a nuclear reactor is much, much, much lower than what you would need for, I guess it's called weapons grade uranium, right? And so you need much more, I think, sophisticated machinery and centrifuges to get it up to those high concentrations. And I guess the point is that it becomes pretty obvious when you are trying to make uranium fuel for a reactor versus for a potential weapon. So fabrication from powder goes into pellets that that then become components of fuel rods. Um, After those fuel rods are used in the reactor, and we'll talk about kind of this end step phases a little bit more in just a second, but that fuel will end up getting stored for some amount of time. In some cases, you can reprocess the uranium in order to extract stuff that is unused and that you would want to be able to employ in your nuclear facility. Again, so it's more kind of cyclical as opposed to just getting mined uranium. But this is not practiced in the US, at least as I understand. Okay, and so we'll talk a little bit more specifics about what actually happens in the reactor in just a moment. High level, we'll take a look at the basic schematic of a nuclear power plant. And so, yeah, as you kind of look at this diagram, this should look pretty familiar, right? So, with a lot of other steam turbines that we've looked at, both in coal plants and in combined cycle plants, we have many sort of similar features, right? And so, you've got a boiler that produces steam. That steam is passed through a turbine, which spins a generator to produce electricity. Okay, and following the steam going through the turbine, it is condensed via a secondary external cooling water source, right? And so, as we had discussed in the coal plant, there is a closed loop of water here going from the boiler, becoming steam, passing through the turbine, condensing, and then getting pumped back into the boiler, right? So that's a closed loop system. We can use a pure stream of water to feed the turbine, and then a separate stream of cooling water from a reservoir or from a local sort of water source like a river that can be used externally, and that's the water that gets evaporated and you see leaving out of those cooling towers. Okay, and so what is unique about the nuclear plant? So we're not doing any combustion of any sort, and so there isn't, the other pollution control chimneys that you would see in a traditional fossil fuel plant. But instead, we actually have another loop, closed loop of water. Well, it'll be some sort of fluid. And so here is where the nuclear reactor resides. And so you have control rods that go into a reactor. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, but essentially you've got your nuclear reaction happening here. And the product of the nuclear reaction, so there is some of that nuclear waste that we were talking about with the barium and krypton, but you're producing a lot of heat as a result of your nuclear fission. That's going to heat up this liquid, which is the thing that actually boils the water, right? And so here we have yet another closed loop system, right? And hopefully it'll be sort of intuitive at this point, right? So the stuff passing through this system is going to be highly radioactive, which is why we have a separate closed loop so that you're not sending this fluid through the turbine and then having to deal with maintenance on a radioactive turbine. And so this whole nuclear reactor is going to be contained in this containment structure so that if there are sort of any incidents that then the issues with like radiation and nuclear fuel can be sort of contained within a closed structure. So let's talk a little bit more detail about the actual operation of the nuclear reactor. And so what you have uh, in the actual reactor, um, you've got your actual nuclear fuel. So this is our fissile uranium that's contained in a moderator. And so what the moderator does, okay, so let's see here. So first thing, right, is our fuel assembly. So the fuel itself might be UO2 or MOX. So that's a mixed oxide of uranium and plutonium. So this actually contains the uranium 235 where our fission is occurring. And those pellets of UO2 or MOX are going to be in these sort of fuel rods. So the moderator is a very important component of the nuclear reaction. So this is either heavy water or graphite. And basically, this is material that's going to take neutrons that are kind of flying around inside of our reactor, right? So, because that's what actually propagates our nuclear reaction, it slows them down. It slows them down a lot. Okay, and so yeah, I forget the actual kind of speeds, but many orders of magnitude slower. Um, they're still very fast, right? Very very fast relative to things that we tend to think about, but much slower than the speeds close to light speed that they might be traveling. So we wouldn't be talking about them in fractions of c light speed. And essentially what this does is it helps to increase the probability of fission. Once the neutrons are traveling a little bit slower, that's going to accelerate your nuclear reaction activity. So the way that you can help to essentially control the speed of those reactions is the use of control rods. And so these are rods that essentially get lowered down into your reactor, and they can be comprised of different types of material. So boron, silver, indium, cadmium, or hafnium. And these control rods essentially will catch neutrons. So they're going to absorb neutrons that are in the reactor that would normally you'd want to be facilitating your nuclear reaction. And so if the power production is too high, right, what you could do is you start lowering the control rods into your reactor area. That reduces the amount of neutrons that are available for reaction, and thus start slowing that entire process down. And so, yeah, this is a sort of our two sort of control mechanisms, right, with our moderator and our control rods. And if you like fully lower in all of the control rods into the reactor, for example, you can totally kill all of the nuclear reaction that's happening in the reactor. And so actually, if anyone has seen the show Chernobyl, right? So there's a whole bit about how this particular the assembly in Chernobyl nuclear reactor was problematic because the control rods actually had graphite tips, and graphite actually, right, as you can see, is sometimes even used as a moderator, accelerates the reaction. And so in that particular case, because the tips were graphite, when they tried to lower the control rods in a very kind of specific setting and scenario, it led to a sort of chain reaction that led to the reactor exploding. But that's from a safety perspective, that's something that's kind of well known at this point, and would be you'd be pretty hard pressed to have something like that happen in modern day nuclear reactors. Okay, coolant. So this is typically pressurized water. So this removes heat from fuel and it transports it to the steam generator or directly to directly to the turbine. And so this is the thing that helps essentially remove the water. This is the thing that removes the heat from the system. And yeah, it without the water, you could have issues with the reactor getting too hot and melting. So it is a key component of the sort of nuclear reactor. Um, and it conveniently is the thing that allows us to generate electricity, right, with hot water. Okay, and so that's like high level, super basics about what happens in a nuclear reactor. Obviously, this is kept pretty light in terms of the details, but hopefully, this gives you some context to see kind of the differences in terms of what's happening within the reactor relative to some of the other power plants that we've talked about, such as coal and natural gas. Uh, yeah, in some respects, the power plants are very similar, right, in the way that we take advantage of heat, but the way that we generate the heat is pretty different. Okay, and so you've got these fuel rods in the nuclear reactor. They've got U-235 that transforms right into um, other atoms that are no longer viable for us to use as nuclear fuel. And so you've got these fuel rods that are now sort of full of essentially nuclear waste, right? And there are specific problems with dealing with nuclear waste that are unique to the nuclear industry that you wouldn't necessarily have to deal with in other sort of fuel technologies. Um, those fuel rods can be very hot and they can be radioactive, right? And so you need to provide both cooling and radiation shielding when you remove them from a reactor. And so at the actual nuclear facilities, they actually have waste storage. And so the first place that you take those fuel rods is to be stored in what are known as these spent fuel pools. And so they are stored here temporarily for anywhere between 5 to 10 years. So after this kind of wet disposal, then and some of the material has cooled down, you are then able to do dry cask storage. So this is passive cooling, and once again, typically on site for most nuclear plants in the U.S. And these are, I guess, designated as longer term longer term storage, right? So these are designed for on the order of several decades to up to a century worth of storage. And that's essentially how we sort of deal with all of the nuclear waste so far in the US. And as you'll recall, nuclear power plants have been around right since the 70s. So most of the stuff is 50 years old at this point. So still, we're not, if we're thinking about this more on the sort of century long scale, then we've still got some time before we have to deal with this nuclear waste in a more sort of permanent way. And so the general process for longer term storage actually already exists. People have thought about how to do this. And so This is kind of termed as geological disposal of nuclear fuel. And this is definitely a longer term solution, right? So the fuel is repackaged into disposal containers, and then you bury it deep underground. So you're going to remove it from the dry cask storage. You actually have to use slightly different designed containers so that it's more tolerable to certain levels of risk, and that you can achieve sort of higher safety measures. And so these canisters get packed in a specific way. You've got these canisters that go into what's known as a copper overpack, and then you have additional sort of buffer around that, which is backfilled into these sort of tunnels that are buried deep, deep, deep underground. And the idea here is that once you've got it in this geological solution, you no longer have to deal with it for the sort of foreseeable future, right? So these are meant to be like hundreds of thousands of years long in terms of storage. And so this is essentially how you get rid of your nuclear waste in the long term. And so geological disposal has been discussed in the US, but is not something that is currently being done. There are, in addition to maybe some of the technological and economic concerns about doing this, you've also got complaints, so NIMBYism, right? And so worries about if this is going to be located near, a population center, near where people live, and protests against that have essentially made it so that this type of disposal procedure has not really been able to gain traction in the US. And as a result, we currently store still most of our spent nuclear fuel on site. All right. So let's talk about some of the operational attributes of nuclear power. Thermal efficiency. Again, a lot of the stuff that we're getting whenever we're translating from heat tends to be not as efficient. And so depending on the type of reactor, you might have slight differences in efficiency, but generally you're going to be on the 30 to 35% efficient range. That being said, people don't really think about efficiency with nuclear reactors quite in the same way as they do with, let's say, fossil combustion, just by the nature of the energy density of the fuel. I shouldn't say that people don't think about efficiency, but it's thought about in, let's say, a slightly sort of different way. Your constraints are more having to do with other things like the materials and safety of the nuclear plant. The capacities of nuclear reactors tend to be a lot larger. I guess I didn't have any slides on smaller nuclear reactors, so maybe I'll kind of mention that here. There is a different type of nuclear reactor that's been discussed in the sort of more recent times, I would say over the last kind of 2 decades. Remember, when I was in grad school, there was a lot of talk about it. So small modular reactors, which are these kind of like portable generation facilities. You might think of them as being able to be towed around on the back of like an 18-wheeler. And so those are essentially nuclear reactors that are much smaller in size and maybe kind of in the tens of megawatts. But that technology is still in its infancy, and certainly is not deployed to provide electricity in the US yet. And so when we talk about nuclear, we're not really talking about these small modular reactors and more on sort of the mainstream large scale nuclear power, which are going to tend to be around about a gigawatt at a minimum. So there do exist smaller nuclear facilities around the world, maybe even the like 500 megawatt range at the smallest. But most of the builds for these things are going to be 1 gigawatt plus. Capacity factor. So this is probably one of the more unique ones. Um, Nuclear likes to be on basically as much as possible. As you can imagine, like controlling nuclear reactions and like ramping it up and down, starting a nuclear reaction from scratch, and kind of controlling it with a, let's say, a slightly more um, like a ham-fisted way of lowering these control rods in and out, right? That level of control maybe is less granular than you might like, and so nuclear power likes to basically stay on at full bore most of the time, and so you have these pretty high capacity factors, like uh, you know at the 90% plus, right? In the U.S., the average is around 92%, and this is going to be the highest capacity factor of any sort of fuel technology in the U.S. The only time that you're really bringing it down is in specific conditions on the grid and when you need to perform maintenance. The ramp rate, very slow. There are ways of accelerating them, but actually there's rules, sort of safety rules about accelerating the ramp rate too quickly, which is probably logical for something like this. So you're getting something on the order of like 1% a minute, right? And so it can take several hours to ramp from fully off to all the way on, in addition to having sort of large startup times. So you can imagine restarting a nuclear reaction might take some time, and so um, the refueling piece of it uh, is long enough that often you're doing this from a cold shutdown, and those outages from refueling can last several days, and so that's in addition to any sort of maintenance you might be doing, a big determinant of your annual capacity factor. Okay, and so as a result of the sort of technical factors of your nuclear power plant, generally we're going to consider this to be sort of just base load, right? And it's not really going to be very responsive to changes in demand. Okay, what do the economics of nuclear power look like? Overnight capital cost. This is the big one. Okay, so $6,000 to $12,000 per kilowatt. So we we looked at this figure here. Let me just jump back really quickly. So looking back at this figure, okay, why did we stop building nuclear power? And so from just the economics perspective, right? Um, Once we're in the 90s and 2000s, natural gas, the overnight capital cost of natural gas is just so much lower. Again, that's not everything, right? Because you have to think about how much you're spending on fuel prices um, and other aspects related to it. But this is, it can be as high as an order of magnitude larger. And so just from the perspective of like securing the financing for something like a giant nuclear power project, which again is going to have oftentimes minimum, 1 gigawatt plus, right? And so you're talking about, oh, the cost to do a 1 gigawatt natural gas combined cycle plant might be something on the order of like $1 billion, whereas for nuclear, the same capacity size would be 10 times higher, right? 10 billion, $12 billion. And even if the fueling bit is free and you have well, not free with nuclear power. It's much it is relatively low cost because of the high energy density. You have to be able to make that up, all of that financing for your overnight capital cost. And so purely from an economics perspective, putting aside any, worries about safety or population pushback, it can be a sort of difficult prospect to think about nuclear power being successful in this day and age. Yeah, and we'll get back to that a little bit more in a moment. The other piece that is difficult, right, is the construction duration is so long. And so, why is it that someone, if I need that power right away, let's say for meeting some of this new data center demand, right, that I want, basically, some of these companies want these power plants to be deployed yesterday, right? And so why would I spend 10 times more money and wait 10 times as long, right, to construct a nuclear power plant? Yes, and so going back to the fuel cost piece, the next item in this list, um, yeah, the fuel can be relatively small portion of your life cycle costs in comparison to some of the fossil fuels where that percentage is going to be quite a bit higher. Um, Most of the cost is in the fabrication and enrichment of the fuel, but generally speaking, the stuff is pretty stable, and you can have inventories for many, many years as opposed to, some of the fossil fuel stuff where you're running through your entire imports, on a daily basis. Your operations and maintenance can be pretty intensive, right? So the staff needed for operations in a nuclear power plant is pretty high. Um, the variable O&M might be a little bit lower relatively speaking, but you do have a lot of things to deal with, like waste handling, chemical control, and that sort of thing. There's also a non-insignificant decommissioning cost to kind of take these things apart, and those costs have to be recovered um, over long periods of time. What does the O&M look like for labor and staffing? So you have to have reactor operators, technicians, radiation protection. You have to have security, right? And that might be a little bit more robust than the security that more traditional fossil plants. Definitely the most labor-intensive technology. You're talking about on the order of 500 to 1,000 people staffing any single nuclear power plant. Scheduled maintenance and surveillance, fuel handling, refueling outages, radiation protection and waste management. That is again something unique probably to nuclear power. You have some of this maybe in something like coal, but it's going to be a lot more robust at a nuclear power plant. Chemical and water treatment. So this may seem obvious, but I'll also say, right, from a regulatory perspective, um, you want to be really buttoned up, right, with nuclear power, and so this stuff is treated very seriously at nuclear facilities. Um, yeah, actually, there's a joke that if you wanted to expose yourself to the lowest level of radiation in the entire world, the probably place to go would be inside of a nuclear power plant, which actually has significantly lower background radiation than what you would be exposed to on an everyday basis, simply because the amount of radiation shielding that they have in these facilities is so high. And so, ironically, a nuclear plant worker is likely to be exposed to less radiation than the sort of average person in the country. Yeah, and so the security requirements is a unique aspect of nuclear plants, and these are required by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Yeah, and so when you add up all of those costs and think about what that looks like in the sort of range of LCOEs, nuclear tends to look not as competitive economically compared to a lot of other sort of generation technologies. And that is kind of more purely on the economics, which is one of the factors that you want to think about when you are considering alternatives for generation of electricity. And I guess what I'll say is the environmental benefits of nuclear are actually very compelling, right? Because you don't have any combustion, and it can provide a very valuable type of resource in baseload, which is an increasing challenge in a world where you have a lot more renewables. That baseload starts looking pretty compelling. It also doesn't have to be sort of co-located with any sort of geographical locations for resource like you do with solar and wind, right? You could place a nuclear plant anywhere, and so one of the big benefits is going to be lower costs associated with the transmission and distribution of electricity from these types of facilities, because I can kind of co-locate them with population centers. That is, if the population lets you build a nuclear plant there, which is not always the case. Okay, and so, kind of continuing on with, why is it that nuclear plants, haven't been deployed as much? The economics, right, is certainly a piece of it, and actually, because of the very high capital costs and the intensity needed in investment, we did see a lot of bankruptcies of companies, construction companies, and folks who were trying to build nuclear power plants in the past. NIMBY opposition. So, would you like to have a nuclear power plant operating in your backyard? Maybe if you're really energy literate and you have, you are familiar with the way that a nuclear power plant works, and you're familiar with actually, nuclear plants being one of the sort of safest options, and sort of least polluting and leading to, even like cancer outcomes from radiation is higher at coal facilities than they are at nuclear power, and so you might be familiar with all those things, but all of your neighbors, is your city going to be willing to approve a nuclear power plant being constructed in the county that you live in, right? And so there is aspects of NIMBYism that makes it very difficult to certify and approve nuclear power plants being constructed kind of anywhere near a population center. The environmental benefits I mentioned are very compelling, but then there are also these alternatives in wind and solar that have made a big difference as well. And kind of on the back of everyone's mind, you've got Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, there's this kind of disaster factor that is present with nuclear power that you don't really see with any other sort of power generation unit, and that can lead to, um, yeah, big pushback against the development of this as a technology. And so, yeah, a lot of people will ask me, like, oh, why don't we just do more nuclear? And I think that there are a number of sort of compelling reasons to do it. That they provide stable baseload power, and they are sort of as just as clean as most renewables. Um, but you do have some real difficulties with the economics of it. You have unresolved issues related to nuclear waste handling and disposal, and you've got to deal somehow with the sort of popularity arguments against nuclear power. And our very state of California has had to deal with issues surrounding nuclear energy. I think I asked this of folks before, right? But we've got one nuclear plant left in California, um, uh, which I'll talk about in just a second. So this is a picture of a nuclear power plant. This is actually not a power plant that is in operation anymore. Um, I don't want to say it's necessarily like near and dear to my heart per se, but it was very familiar growing up. So I grew up in San Diego, and anytime we would drive up to Los Angeles, you would see this nuclear power plant kind of right on the beach, right? So the big highway that you see running right next to this power plant is actually Highway 5, that runs all the way up, past where we are, through Sacramento. But down in SoCal, where this is located, this nuclear power plant sits kind of right in between San Diego and Los Angeles, outside of Camp Pendleton. It's one of the sort of big military bases. That's literally, if you see those mountains in the background, right on the other side of that is where Camp Pendleton is located. So these are the San Onofre nuclear power plants, and yeah, any of you folks who are from Southern California have likely seen this before, and actually, those two domes are currently in the process, or just started to be getting torn down. So actually, that the very familiar site will be gone in a couple of years. So these nuclear plants were retired in 2013, and as I mentioned, the decommissioning is currently sort of underway. And so, why did it get shut down? So, there was premature wear in some of the steam generators in two of the units, and as a result, they decided instead of spending the money to go in and repair and retrofit these generators, that they would instead decide to just mothball that's the entire power plant. So because of regulatory and technical uncertainty around this, that decision was made. The economics of that repair were generally unfavorable, increased scrutiny from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and having a risk of sort of prolonged outage, which means that the way that you're able to kind of make your money is at higher risk. Okay, and so these plants produced two plus gigawatts of baseload capacity in a relatively constrained grid area. And so I recall at the time that these were retired, there was, quite a lot of scrambling that had to be done to replace that power supply. The decommissioning itself is a 20 plus year long process. So we are kind of halfway through that with a total cost of several $billions. And as far as the nuclear waste, right, we don't have geological storage. And so we kind of indefinitely are storing that at that nuclear site. So that was our second to last nuclear plant, the one that was most recently in the process of being decommissioned. This guy here, this is the Diablo Canyon Nuclear Power Plant. So located on the coast north of Los Angeles, kind of in the San Luis Obispo region. So currently still operating. It's our last nuclear plant that's still operating. Actually was originally scheduled to retire and start decommissioning process in 2025, just last year. But an extension was approved several years ago by the California legislature to continue its operation out into for a decade or so, pending a review from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. You know, it was originally slated to be retired, but there was a lot of concern, I think, in the energy community about the needs of our system for grid reliability, and that if you were to suddenly pull out 2 gigawatts of baseload power in this California grid that has such high renewables penetration, that we would essentially get in some trouble, right? In what resources would be available to replace, this sort of continuous 2 gigawatt output, right? And so solar would not be able to replace it unless you were to couple it with, slightly expensive storage options. And so with the deferral of a lot of gas build out, right? So we're building less natural gas in California because of our aims at kind of decarbonization. That gave pause for the decommission of this particular plant. Yeah, so this provides a lot of grid services to the coastal region in the area, and the clean base load essentially allows for a reduction in a lot of curtailment of renewables, right? Because if you consider that in order to provide the same amount of energy at the right times during the day or at night, you have to build out renewables to what I would think of as kind of an inefficient extent, right? Because to provide the power at a time where you have low generation from a solar facility or a wind facility means you need to overbuild, and that means that at other times you're producing way too much power, and so you're curtailing it. And so nuclear plants are nice in allowing the system to run a little bit more efficiently in those cases and reducing the overbuild potential for renewables. From an economic context, there was a lot of analysis done on retrofitting this nuclear plant compared to retiring it, and it was essentially deemed feasible. And as part of the approval to extend the operational lifetime of this plant, our legislature did provide some financial support in order to maintain the operations of this nuke. Yeah, and so this is like a very sort of classic case study between kind of, okay, as you approach the end of the lifetime for this nuclear plant, should we extend it or should we decommission it, right? And so the San Onofre and the Diablo Canyon power plants are kind of these stand in contrast, that in just a span of like less than 10 years, a different sort of decision was made to kind of decommission versus extend that nuclear plant. And I will say that some of the impacts of decommissioning San Onofre were definitely relevant in the thought process for the extension of the Diablo Canyon nuclear power. So you've got things that you want to think about with the technical aspects and the economic aspects of that decision. You have to look at the reliability and the value of having a particular generation facility in that specific location. Um, One of the byproducts of closing the San Onofre uh, reactors was actually a big increase in carbon emissions because we essentially had to rely on gas generation in order to replace the electricity generation. There is a similar story to this in Europe. So Germany chose, kind of in the decade plus time scale ago, to retire a lot of their nuclear power. Um, and there are a number of concerns and reasons why that happened, right? But as a result of closing a number of nuclear power plants in Germany, carbon emissions went up quite a bit in the short term, at least. There was a lot of coal and natural gas generation that had to be turned back on in order to meet and replace the electricity generation that those nuclear facilities in Germany had originally been producing. Um, in sort of the longer term, a lot of that has been replaced by renewables. But definitely there was a large short-term impact that a lot of environmentalists kind of decried as bad decision making, right? But you have to remember that these environmental impacts are just one piece of the puzzle when you think about the decision making that goes behind whether we extend or decommission a facility. Yeah, so costs and decommissioning dynamics, it's actually, it can be just as expensive to take apart a nuclear plant as actually building it. And so that can play a role in thinking about whether or not we want to keep going. Um, and then liability over the nuclear waste is, particularly in the U.S., is not well dealt with these days at the current time. Okay, and then public perception. Um, I think public perception was a big driver for the original retirement of San Onofre, but the winds change for things like that. With Diablo Canyon, there was, I think, a sort of shift in the way that people thought about nuclear, with energy reliability concerns and with climate commitments, and what would be kind of the impacts of decommissioning our last nuclear power plant, especially from what we learned from San Onofre. Okay, and so that covers our kind of large, large scale generation of electricity across kind of the major fuel types. What I'm going to do now is we're going to talk about uh, first grid scale storage, which is not a generation type, but I think is important enough to talk about. And we'll talk about mainly focusing on the mechanics of storage here, kind of in the same way that we talked about the infrastructure. There's a whole separate piece of like the operations of these. And how they play into markets and distributed energy that we're going to talk about later on in this class. But we're going to just make sure that everyone's kind of at the same page in terms of what we are talking about with grid scale storage. And then we're going to talk about, to close out, some of the more niche generation technologies that exist out there. Those niche technologies are not widespread, um, and I would generally not kind of put put my money on them being the next kind of big thing, but probably still good to talk about and understand. All right, so storage. Uh, Not traditional generation, not a power plant in the way that we kind of traditionally think about it. It does not create new energy, but rather we think about storage as a way to shift energy in time. And so you can change the profile of your supply curve, but not its total quantity. And in fact, your total quantity is always going to be a little bit lower because of efficiency losses. So storage is a temporal arbitrage device. It absorbs energy and electricity when you have a surplus of it and returns it when the grid needs it. And so think about, let's build a whole ton of solar. Let's have nothing but solar, right? The way that people use electricity is a lot during the day and a little bit less at night. But from the supply curve perspective on solar, you produce a lot during the day, but you don't produce anything at night, right? And so you don't want to have a blackout, and you don't want to have to turn off your electricity grid every day at nighttime, right? And so you could instead have extra solar stuff that happens during the day, send that electricity into a battery, and that battery can discharge at night while the solar panels aren't able to operate. So that's kind of the idea here, and hopefully most of you guys are relatively familiar with the way that would work. What are the main storage technologies that we use? We actually already talked about one of the big ones, right, which is pumped hydro. Here, pumped storage. But actually, the big one, the most dominant technology today that we think about with storage is lithium-ion batteries. The vast majority of new storage getting introduced to the grid is lithium-ion batteries. These are a great resource because they are fast, they're modular, so I can have facilities of various sizes, and I can kind of put them anywhere that I want. And they can do things like helping with frequency regulation. They can smooth renewable supply profiles, and they can provide bulk sort of shifting of energy, on the order of 1 to 4 hours. Pumped storage. This is something that we've already covered, so I'm not going to talk too much about this. From a global perspective, this is actually where most installed storage currently exists, because it's kind of the most oldest and stable technology and relatively inexpensive. And I should kind of mention that with batteries, that's going to definitely be one of the cons right now, is the cost of these things, right? Because these aren't actually buying you more power, they're helping you shift power, and that is valuable to some extent. But generally speaking, the cost is one of the reasons why it has not been as widespread as it is, as we might want. But that because of the cost coming down so rapidly over the last couple of years, we have seen corresponding increases in capacity of this stuff being deployed in places like California. There's other types of batteries, these flow batteries that we think about to be used at the grid scale. There are specific attributes associated with these types of batteries that make them maybe compelling in some ways compared to lithium ion. So you might have scalable duration, longer life cycle, or longer cycle lives than lithium ion, so you could use it for a much longer period of time, although usually they're going to be sort of lower energy density. Okay, this is not meant to be a refresher for our lecture one, but rather there is this thing about batteries that really annoys me sometimes. If you were to ask me while I have my, transportation hat on, where I'm thinking about small scale electric vehicles, and you say, oh, how much, what's the battery size or battery capacity of, the battery in your Mach-E, right? And I'll say, okay, it's got 23 kilowatt hours, right? In reference to the fact that the battery contains some amount of energy. So here's where it gets confusing. Um, when I'm talking with my grid hat on and I'm thinking about the electricity system, right, the way that we talk about capacity for power generation is in terms of instantaneous power, right? So how much power can a particular generator produce? And so an artifact of this is that batteries are thought of in terms of power capacities. But they don't say that explicitly, which is a source of confusion, and was for me for a long time when I was, starting to do more work in sort of the grid field of things. And so if you're talking to like a grid modeler or something like that, and they say, oh, the capacity of this battery is like 100 megawatts, right? Remember that they are talking about power capacity and not energy capacity. Um, yeah, and so uh, don't correct them and say like, oh, but capacity is in units of energy, and so you should be talking about in megawatt hours, right? And so okay, so if I say 100 megawatt power capacity for a grid scale battery, that is in reference to the amount of power that you typically could be able to discharge from that battery. To understand the energy capacity, is oftentimes the sort of default that assumption that most grid people will be talking about is for a 4 hour battery. Okay, that's kind of the standard duration. Otherwise, they'll specify. They'll say 100 megawatts for a 2 hour battery. So what does that mean? So if I have 100 megawatts for a 4 hour battery, that means I can fully discharge that battery at its rated power capacity for 4 hours. So that would mean the energy capacity of a 100 megawatt power capacity battery is 400 megawatt hours, right? You just multiply by 4. Or I could run it at half the capacity for 8 hours, but the energy capacity would still be 400 megawatt hours. And so that is the way that we think about capacities for grid based storage. We're in the sort of power capacity world. Yeah. So 100 megawatt lithium ion battery with a 4 hour duration, 100 megawatts times 4 hours, that's 400 megawatt hours. Pretty straightforward. Okay, I mentioned, right, the economics of lithium ion batteries becoming increasingly compelling. And so this is something that we pay attention to in the electric vehicle world as well, right? What are the prices of batteries? How are they moving? When will a battery electric car become as affordable as a gas car? That's going to be related to these things. But from the power sector side of things, we are also looking at this to see when the economics of like lithium ion batteries becomes favorable enough that maybe you could pair it with a solar, in which case it becomes more, let's say, dispatchable to an extent, right? It'll be able to perform the same kind of capabilities as let's say like a natural gas plant. Okay, and so as the prices have gone down, we have seen that the capacity uh, deployment of lithium ion batteries has gone up, right, in a sort of very correlated way. And in fact, in the state of California, we're already up to some 12 gigawatts of lithium ion batteries being deployed and used at the grid scale. Okay, so key performance metrics for lithium ion grid storage, power rating, that can vary. Right, because these things are modular, you can take some of them, you can put them together to make larger size facilities. We're usually talking on the order of hundreds of megawatts at the utility scale, but right, you could have this in your garage too, and you could have on the order of tens of kilowatts instead, and so huge variation here, and the sort of modular nature of these batteries makes them easy to scale up in size or down in size. Energy capacity, similar type of thing, and we multiply by a sort of standardized factor to get our energy capacity. And we think about battery duration, which is the energy divided by the power. Usually we're talking about a 4-hour battery as kind of the standard. Okay, you do have efficiency associated with this, right? Because you put energy into the battery and then you put energy out of it. If I were to um, put in 100 units of electricity into the battery, what I would get out would vary between 85 to 90% out. You lose some of the energy in charging the battery itself. Okay, how many times can I cycle my battery up and down? Cycle life. This is known as cycle life, and so the more that you do this, the more your battery starts to degrade. And when we say degrade, it means that the usable capacity will decrease over time. I'm sure you guys are all pretty familiar with this, right? On your iPhones or your Android phones. After a couple years, right, you'll see that the battery drains faster, and essentially what's happening is that instead of a 100 megawatt battery, if I use it and it degrades over time, effectively it might start to reduce down to 95 megawatts to 90 megawatts, and so on and so forth. Yeah, and so you lose some of your usable capacity every year. On average, this is like 1 to 3% per year, and again, that's going to depend on how quickly you're using the battery, discharging and charging it, how many cycles you go through, what the sort of ambient temperature is, if you don't have any like temperature controls. All of these things are going to affect the battery lifetime and its associated degradation rate. The very last row here is just talking about the window that you want to operate your battery in. If you keep your battery all the way empty or kind of all the way full, technically speaking, that's not great for the battery. It will accelerate your degradation. And so usually you have some kind of buffer at the bottom and the top that will keep you from totally operating at 0% or 100%, which can really accelerate the damage to your battery. That's actually general advice for a lot of batteries, like even on your phones or on your laptops. But when you charge your phone or your laptop to 100%, it's not actually 100%. It might be more like 95%, where they have built in the buffer for you. You can't actually see it. It won't show up on the percentage of your battery capacity. So that's usually already dealt with at the sort of consumer level. Batteries are nice because they also respond and ramp very quickly. And so, again, for a lot of the ancillary services that depend on speedy operation, lithium-ion batteries are a valuable resource in those markets. There is no startup shut-off time for these things. Yeah, and then, as I mentioned before, some of the thermal issues that you might want to think about to make sure that the degradation isn't too accelerated. And there are some safety issues to think about with things like thermal runaway risks, where your battery might like catch on fire or something like that. We're not going to talk about this too much, but there are a number of operational pieces associated with batteries that you do want to kind of pay attention to as you're using them. Okay, so lithium-ion batteries are far and away the most common storage technology. And as far as deployments go, it's basically all just lithium-ion batteries. The pumps, hydro already exists. There's not much more to be built, and so it's mostly this stuff. There do exist a couple of other storage technologies that are a little bit more niche, less mainstream, that we just don't see as much. And so I've provided kind of a list of these things here. So compressed air energy storage. Um, this is kind of like with geothermal, where you're using um, these geological formations, or you're artificially building them, but essentially you're storing compressed air as the storage medium. So you might have a motor and compressor that pressurizes that air into a cavern or some kind of reservoir. That reservoir will then push air out through a turbine, and you can control the release of that air, which then makes it into energy storage, right? That'll go through a turbine, which will spin a generator to produce electricity. Not the most efficient, especially relative to lithium ion batteries. But one of the big benefits is that you can do these things at much larger scale and durations than batteries. And so, with the batteries, we're talking about 4 hour duration, whereas here you can be, 8 hours plus. Thermal energy storage. This also has much longer duration, which is one big benefit. And essentially, instead of storing it in chemical energy with a battery, or with this sort of mechanical pressure with compressed air, instead here you store the heat itself, and then extract the heat in a variety of different ways. Yeah, and so this can be relevant at smaller scales. And actually, the university itself has a whole chiller system which uses thermal energy storage. Um, and we are going to have a guest lecturer who I think will be covering at some of that, in terms of some of the unique things that our campus is doing. So stay tuned to hear more information about thermal energy storage. You got hydrogen storage, so this is where I produce hydrogen and then I can store that hydrogen and then use it to produce electricity through a fuel cell, or through combustion later on. This can have even longer duration, so seasonal scale potential. That might be useful for, like, if you have big variation across seasons, across the duration of a year, right? So maybe I have a lot of solar during the summer, but not so much in the winter and spring, or I have a lot of wind in the spring and fall, but not so much in the summer and winter, right? In those cases, you might use the excess electricity generated in some of those seasons that produce more electricity, and then use them later during times and seasons where there's less electricity production. Here, you do have a big barrier where your round trip efficiency is actually relatively poor, and so in this case, yeah, that those round trip efficiencies, you're going to lose a lot more energy than you would with some of these other storage techniques. And so hydrogen is generally not a sort of widespread solution, at least in the modern day. And so flywheels, this is on the total opposite end of the spectrum. You are basically spinning something, and then that rotational energy is stored in the spinning, and then you can extract that energy a little bit later on. But because you can't keep it spinning for long periods of time, right? These are typically considered shorter duration. And so we think about the use of this in the application of like frequency regulation and power quality, which are very, very short durations, like on the second scale or sub-second scale. These sets of technologies, I would say, are all things that are currently in existence. It's like you don't have to necessarily prove anything about the technology to get it to work. Um, yeah, the actual technology works, but as far as its feasibility, that may play into more things like economics. And so we think of these as sort of secondary compared to our primary of our primary technologies of lithium-ion batteries and pumped storage. We have maybe sort of this tertiary set of storage technologies, and these are definitely more on the sort of R&D phase, where definitely not even commercially viable, and sort of the engineering required to think about bridging the gap between R&D and sort of widespread deployment still needs to get worked out. So there are things like supercapacitors, ultracapacitors, liquid air energy storage, gravity-based storage, metal air, iron air batteries, and sodium-based batteries. All of these are, yeah, potential solutions in the future. It may be that a lot of the stars kind of line up for the technology and the economics and the use case to work out that these would be sort of more widely deployed. But yeah, and when we think about this from a sort of systems thinking level and not specific engineering of one technology, these guys have a long way to go, and they have to be able to sort of outcompete some of the other storage options that we've talked about in the lecture. Alrighty, what other generation technologies exist? So here's the sort of fuel generation mix. This one is kind of the US wide. And so we've talked about the big ones, right? Natural gas. We've even talked about oil, right? Which constitutes a very small percentage of the fossil fuel fleet. We've talked about coal and nuclear. And then on the renewable side, we've talked about wind, solar, and hydro. And those are the bulk power supply on the renewable side. But we do see some other smaller sort of niche generation activities and technologies. And so we're just going to do a quick coverage of some of those technologies. So biomass and waste to energy. And so this stuff is operating through a steam turbine, and so you can imagine the sort of diagram and schema of a gas plant, of a coal plant or a nuclear plant that would be similar to what you might see for biomass or waste energy, right? So we combust or gasify organic residue. These things are in the relatively small scale in terms of capacity, so on the tens of megawatts. They do have relatively high capacity factors, but very high capex, right? And so that from the economics perspective, these guys are going to be, more expensive than even a coal plant. A lot of the thermodynamic characteristics are similar to coal. And these types of plants are used in specific contexts. So rural or forestry regions where you have a lot of fuel availability. Municipal solid waste management, also a place that is able to provide fuel that you would use to combust and produce electricity. And then anywhere that basically has kind of a steady feedstock of waste can be a good place to put these things. We've also got combined heat and power, or cogen. And so, one aspect of these plants that we've talked about is the sort of heat that gets lost, right? And so we consider that a lot of that heat energy as less useful, right? It's not hot enough to produce the steam that we need, that would then pass through a turbine to produce electricity. But we as humans use heat for a number of things, and it certainly, if I wanted to heat a building, the heat from my heater doesn't need to be so hot that it could boil water, right? And so there's still useful application of the waste heat that we're talking about at the power plant level. And so you can co-generate heat and power, and be able to take advantage of that waste heat. That might be for district heating, for example. These things tend to be kind of in the similar scale as the biomass facilities that I was just talking about, but on the upper end can get a little bit bigger, so 200 megawatts. Because you capture the useful heat in this sort of byproduct generation of electricity, your overall efficiency numbers goes up, right? Because some of that stuff isn't getting wasted anymore, it's actually getting used. So on-site generation for things like industrial plants at universities. So actually at my grad school, Carnegie Mellon, there was a big combined, well, maybe not that big, but there was a combined heat and power plant that I would bike by on the way to work or on the way to school. Hospitals will use this as well, right? And so larger buildings and facilities that use a lot of process heat, this can become a sort of very useful synergy. The CapEx ends up being not so bad. These things can be relatively cheap, partly thanks to some of the higher efficiencies. And so from an industrial perspective, they can be useful for anything that uses some of that process heat as well. So refineries, chemical plants, paper mills, district heating systems, microgrids, these are all places that combined heat and power are useful for. Even if this is considered maybe a little bit more niche and doesn't see a huge amount of operating capacity, doesn't mean it's not a pretty useful technology where it makes sense to deploy. Okay, very last one that I'm going to talk about is tidal and wave power. Tidal, gravitationally driven water flow to turn underwater turbines, and so those are these propellers in red. And then wave power is oscillating water motion driving mechanical or hydraulic converters. And so these are things that sit on top of the water and will move up and down as waves pass by. And that up and down motion can actually be translated to generating electricity. These are very, very small systems. There are some installed in Europe, I believe, but they're very small, and these are more like pilot demonstrations than anything. Capacity factor is okay, right? On the low end, it looks kind of like solar. On the high end, it might look more like wind. Not dispatchable, but they are predictable, which is a useful feature, right? So you don't run, you can, but it's rare to run into kind of forecasting errors that you might commonly see with something like solar. Okay, but the real kicker, these things are hella expensive. This is like nuclear level territory, if not worse. So very early on the stage of the cost curve, not much of this stuff has been deployed. And just to give a sense of like how bad the economics of this stuff was, in Europe, at some point, maybe like 10 years ago, they were offered crazy incentives to be able to produce this stuff, like insane, like that you could actually build entire uh, entire fleets of other power production unit power generation facilities, and yet people would still not be building this stuff. They were offering something like on the order of like $3,500 a kilowatt, and people still were not building this technology. So the economics are very disfavorable for this technology. But I could be totally wrong, and I might eat my words at some point. But I wouldn't really put my money on this generation technology. Okay, so backing out for today, and to some extent for covering sort of all of the infrastructure generation technologies that we've talked about, right? So no single technology is going to solve all of our problems. We have seen, and hopefully this is kind of apparent to you, that across the many different technology options that we've covered, there are lots of pros and cons to them, right? In terms of costs and economics, in terms of environmental impacts, in terms of like public perception. And so I am always a little bit skeptical whenever you hear of like these silver bullet technology solutions, or of people who advocate solely for one particular technology as the kind of savior for whatever it is that they're that they're trying to save, right? I think that the the operational attributes, the economic attributes, um, and the diversity of those means that there is a place for different types of generation in our grid to provide different sorts of services, and that I don't think that that's going to go away, and that I don't think there's going to be one technology that's going to be so clearly superior across all of those operational and economic aspects that it will outperform everyone. And speaking of that, right, with those operational aspects, complementarity is a really important thing to think about, right? And so where and when does a particular technology option make sense, right? And so we want nuclear to provide baseload. We want solar and wind to provide affordable, low carbon solutions. We may want natural gas, right, to be able to be fast dispatchable option. And then maybe at some point we'd like affordable storage to replace that, as you have more and more renewables, right? And so think about what options are good at what things. And I think that's going to help not only help you understand why our grid is the way it is today, but also to understand where we need to move to, and what things can help us get to some kind of objective, whether it be affordable electricity or it be decarbonized electricity. And just remember that economics is one of the big drivers for why we have the things we have today, right? As I talk about things being really expensive or really cheap, and how that's changed over time, I think you can look back and correlate that pretty well to when things are starting to accelerate in growth, when things kind of fall off, right? And I think we've seen that across the different technologies. Um, and policy can be a big driver too. We're going to talk a lot more later on in the class about certain things that have pushed for certain technologies, and hopefully that'll become kind of very obvious to you guys as we think about some of those policies and their impacts. Okay, and so that covers basically the major generation technologies that we're gonna often think about in this class. And so uh, diving or sort of widening out from all of this, uh, that helps cover maybe a third of the sort of infrastructure when we think about the division of our electricity grid into the three main components of generation, transmission, and distribution. And so next week, or I guess it depends when you watch this video, but in our next set of lectures, we're going to be covering the transmission system and the distribution system in a similar way before we dive into the markets of how the grid actually ends up operating. So that's it for today. A little bit shorter of a lecture, but hopefully still informative. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys for the next lecture.